before humans planted a single crop, before we tamed a single sheep, a single goat, a single chicken. Before agriculture existed in any form anywhere on Earth, our ancestors did something far stranger and far more dangerous. They domesticated an apex predator, not a small or harmless one. A pack-hunting carnivore capable of killing an adult human without much effort. And the really unsettling part is this. The evidence increasingly suggests it might not have been our idea. Let's start with the timeline, because it is the part that breaks most people's assumptions immediately. Sheep were domesticated roughly 11,000 years ago, goats around the same time, cattle a little later. Agriculture itself, the planting of deliberate crops in deliberate locations, emerges around 12,000 years ago in the Fertile Crescent. Dogs, by contrast, were already fully dogs by then. Genetic studies comparing modern dog and wolf DNA place the divergence between the two lineages somewhere between 20,000 and 40,000 years ago, with some estimates pushing even earlier, which means the relationship between humans and dogs predates farming by tens of thousands of years. It predates permanent settlements. It predates pottery, writing, and almost every other marker we use to define the beginning of civilization. Before humans had figured out how to grow their own food reliably, they had already, somehow, recruited a wolf. The traditional story most people learn is simple and satisfying. Early humans found wolf pups, raised them by hand, and selectively bred the friendliest ones over generations until they became dogs. It is a clean narrative. It puts humans firmly in control. And increasingly, researchers think it is probably not what actually happened, or at least not the whole story. In 2017, evolutionary biologists studying the self-domestication hypothesis proposed a far stranger alternative. Wolves living near human camps would have had access to something really valuable, a continuous, low-effort supply of food scraps, bones, and waste, available without the risk of hunting large prey. Among any wolf population, some individuals are naturally less fearful of humans than others, a trait with a real genetic and hormonal basis tied to the same biological systems that produce tameness in other species. Those bolder, less reactive wolves could approach the edges of camp and scavenge. The more fearful wolves kept their distance and missed out. Over many generations, the wolves who tolerated proximity to humans simply outcompeted the wolves who didn't, not because humans selected them, but because human camps had inadvertently created an ecological niche that rewarded calmness over aggression. Humans never had to lift a hand. The wolves did the selecting on themselves, which is either the most flattering or the most mildly insulting thing your dog has ever accomplished, depending on how attached you are to thinking you chose him. This is the reframe that should unsettle you a little. Domestication is usually told as a story of human mastery. We picked the wheat we wanted, we bred the cattle we wanted, we shaped the dog into whatever we needed. But the earliest and most successful domestication event in human history may have started with the domesticated species essentially nominating itself. The wolves who became dogs may not have been chosen, they may have applied, and the risk calculus on the human side was very strange. Imagine living in a small band 30,000 years ago, already vulnerable to disease, starvation, and every other large predator sharing your landscape, and watching wolves begin to linger at the edge of your firelight. The obvious evolutionarily sensible response is to kill them, drive them off, or move camp entirely. Instead, at some point, enough human groups tolerated the proximity that the relationship had time to deepen. The benefit, once it arrived, was significant. Wolves and early dogs could detect approaching predators or rival humans long before people could. They could help run down prey during hunts, and their presence near camp functioned as an early warning system that never needed to sleep in shifts. But none of that benefit was available on day one. Somebody somewhere had to tolerate an apex predator's presence for long enough, across enough generations, for the relationship to become worth the risk. That is not a small thing to ask of a species that was, at the time, barely surviving itself. The archaeological evidence for how far this relationship eventually went is remarkable. At a site in Předmostí in the modern Czech Republic, dating to roughly 27,000 years ago, archaeologists found the skeleton of a canid deliberately buried with a bone placed in its mouth, a treatment closely mirroring the grave goods given to deceased humans at the same site. Researchers studying the skull identified features consistent with early domestication rather than a wild wolf. Whatever this animal was, wolf, early dog, or something in between, it had been incorporated into the symbolic and ritual world of the humans living there. It was not just tolerated. It was in some sense mourned. Similar canid remains showing comparable signs of early domestication have since been identified at sites in Belgium and Russia dating to a similar period, suggesting this was not an isolated relationship in one lucky valley, but something happening independently or in parallel across a wide stretch of Ice Age Europe. And here is where the story turns somewhat philosophical. For the entire history of the genus Homo, us had always meant something biologically narrow. Members of your own species, usually your own group, often your own kin. Every other animal was, by default, prey, threat, or background noise. The wolf-to-dog relationship is the first clearly documented case of a different category appearing, a creature that was not human, not kin, not even the same species, being folded into the circle of trust normally reserved for family. The boundary of us turned out to be movable. It was never a fixed biological fact. It was a negotiation, and the first species we ever negotiated it with wasn't human at all. That negotiation reshaped both species permanently. Dogs underwent dramatic physical changes almost immediately by evolutionary standards. Smaller skulls relative to body size, floppier ears, shorter snouts, a reduced startle response, and an extended capacity for what researchers call interspecies eye contact, a behavior wild wolves essentially never perform with humans but that domestic dogs do constantly, releasing oxytocin in both the dog and the human on the receiving end. That is not a coincidence. It is the literal neurochemistry of trust, evolving in real time between two species that had no evolutionary reason to develop it for each other, and developed it anyway. Humans change too, in less visible but equally real ways. Bands with dogs likely hunted more efficiently, slept more securely, and detected danger earlier than bands without them. The relationship paid for itself on both sides for 30,000 years and counting, which is a longer unbroken track record than most modern institutions can claim, let alone most modern relationships. So think again about the dog you know, whether it is asleep on a couch right now or trotting on a leash past a stranger without a flicker of fear. That animal is carrying, somewhere in its nervous system, the inherited confidence of a population of wolves who made an extraordinary, almost incomprehensible bet tens of thousands of years before agriculture, before cities, before almost anything we associate with human civilization. They bet that proximity to a dangerous, unpredictable, frequently hungry species of upright apes was safer than staying away. They were right, and every wagging tail, every interspecies eye contact, every dog curled trustingly at a human's feet today is the present tense outcome of that ancient and entirely mutual gamble. We did not simply tame the wolf. Somewhere at the edge of an ancient fire, the wolf looked at us, decided we were worth the risk, and stayed. It has been staying ever since, and at this point it is probably waiting by the door for you right now. No idea any of this happened, just glad you're home.